The tension inside the New York Supreme Court was almost suffocating. The room was packed. Reporters, spectators, and legal interns eager to witness what seemed like an open and shut case. At the defense table sat Sophia Carter, a 22-year-old financial analyst accused of fraud and identity theft. The charges? Allegedly stealing over $200,000 by accessing clients' financial data from her former company, Westgate Investments. Judge Richard Holloway peered down at her, skepticism clear in his cold blue eyes. He had seen countless white-collar criminals, most of them older, wealthier men, but a young woman like Sophia? That was a novelty. At the prosecutor's table stood David Lancaster, a sharp, experienced trial attorney. His suit was crisp, his voice smooth with confidence. To him, Sophia was just another fraudster who got caught, and now she was about to face the full weight of the justice system. What no one knew, not the judge, not the jury, not even Lancaster, was that Sophia wasn't just another defendant. She had spent years learning the law from someone who knew the system inside out. Her mother, a former forensic accountant for the FBI. And today, Sophia wasn't here to plead for mercy. She was here to win. Judge Holloway sighed, flipping through the case file. His voice was dry, almost bored. Let's make this quick. The evidence is overwhelming. Miss Carter, I assume your defense attorney is ready to proceed? Sophia sat motionless, her fingers intertwined on the table. Next to her, public defender Lisa Thornton hesitated before rising. Her posture screamed uncertainty. It was obvious she hadn't spent much time reviewing the case. Sophia took a breath. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Your Honor, she said, standing up smoothly, I'll be representing myself. The courtroom went still. Judge Holloway's brows lifted in amusement. Excuse me? Sophia met his gaze without hesitation. I've decided to waive my right to legal counsel. I'll handle my own defense. Laughter rippled through the gallery. Even David Lancaster smirked. This should be entertaining. Judge Holloway leaned back, tapping his gavel lightly. Miss Carter, this is not a reality show. Do you have any legal training? Sophia's lips curled slightly. No formal training. Just experience. The judge sighed, clearly unimpressed. Fine. Proceed. But don't expect sympathy. Lancaster stood confidently, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, the state will prove beyond doubt that Miss Carter orchestrated a scheme to defraud multiple clients of Westgate Investments. Her login credentials were used to authorize unauthorized transfers. Her fingerprints were found on internal financial reports containing fraudulent transactions. And surveillance footage places her at the office the night the money disappeared. The jury exchanged glances. On the surface, it sounded damning. Sophia, however, remained unfazed. Mr. Lancaster, she said, her voice smooth. Before we continue, can I confirm something? Lancaster smirked. Go ahead. Sophia took a slow step forward. You said my fingerprints were found on financial reports proving fraud, correct? Lancaster nodded. Yes, that's correct. Sophia turned to the judge. Your Honor, I move to dismiss that fingerprint evidence. Judge Holloway frowned. On what grounds? Sophia finally smiled. Because I wasn't an accountant. I was an analyst. I never handled physical reports. All data was digital. So why were my prints on documents I never had access to? The courtroom fell silent. Lancaster's smirk wavered. Well, he cleared his throat. Perhaps you touched them incidentally. Sophia tilted her head. Perhaps. But let's verify that, shall we? Your Honor, I request forensic documentation showing where my fingerprints were found. Because if they were placed conveniently on incriminating pages, Then we have a problem. Judge Holloway glanced at Lancaster. Mr. Lancaster, does the prosecution have a forensic breakdown of the fingerprint analysis? A pause. Too long. Sophia knew she had drawn first blood. The weight of the silence pressed down on the courtroom. Judge Holloway tapped his pen against his desk, his expression shifting from amused skepticism to mild annoyance. Mr. Lancaster, he repeated, his tone sharper. Does the prosecution have a forensic report detailing where the defendant's fingerprints were found? David Lancaster's jaw tightened. He shuffled through his stack of papers, buying time. Sophia didn't wait for him to recover. She stepped forward, her voice calm but precise. If I may, Your Honor, since the prosecution seems unprepared to provide that document, let's talk about another key piece of evidence, my login credentials. Lancaster snapped his gaze up, regaining his composure. Yes, let's. Your credentials were used to execute fraudulent transfers. There's a digital footprint. That's indisputable. Sophia nodded, as if considering his words carefully. Digital footprint. That's an interesting phrase, Mr. Lancaster, because there's something you didn't mention. She turned toward the jury, making sure to lock eyes with each of them. The logins happened at 11:47 p.m., but Westgate Investments' security system logs badge swipes at every door. Would you like to know what time my badge was last scanned that evening? She pulled out a printed security log and held it up for the court to see. 7:32 p.m., 4 hours before the fraud occurred. And yet, according to your evidence, I was supposedly inside the office committing the crime? A murmur rippled through the gallery. Some of the jurors shifted uncomfortably. Judge Holloway leaned forward. Mr. Lancaster? Lancaster's confident smirk had disappeared. Your Honor, badge swipes don't prove she left the building. Sophia let out a soft chuckle. You're right. But do you know what does? She turned back to her mother, who sat quietly in the gallery. Janet Carter, a former FBI forensic accountant, stood up and walked forward. Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to submit an affidavit from Westgate's building security. She handed a document to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. Holloway glanced through it, his expression hardening. Sophia continued. That affidavit confirms that my badge was scanned at the building's exit doors at 7:35 p.m. Surveillance footage also shows me leaving. So unless I found a way to teleport back inside hours later, the real question is... She turned, staring directly at Lancaster. Who used my credentials? The gallery erupted into whispers. Even Judge Holloway took off his glasses and exhaled sharply. Lancaster scrambled for control. Your Honor, the fact remains... But Sophia raised a single finger, silencing him. No, Mr. Lancaster. The fact remains that the real fraudster is still out there, and you're prosecuting the wrong person. The courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. Judge Holloway rubbed his temples, clearly frustrated. The case that had seemed so straightforward was beginning to unravel. Sophia let the silence stretch before speaking again, ensuring everyone in the courtroom felt the weight of her words. Your Honor, let's talk about the actual person behind these fraudulent transactions. Lancaster scoffed. Are you suggesting someone framed you? Sophia turned to him with a knowing smile. I'm not suggesting it, Mr. Lancaster. I'm proving it. She walked to the evidence screen and clicked a button on the remote, displaying a detailed access log from Westgate Investments system. This is the internal server log from the night of the crime. She pointed to one crucial detail. The fraudulent transactions were executed at 11:47 p.m. from an IP address inside Westgate Investments. 1 minute later, At 11:48 p.m., an external login attempt was made using the same credentials, but was blocked. Sophia let that sink in. Now, why would someone supposedly inside the building, need to log in externally? A ripple of realization passed through the jury. Even Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. Lancaster wasn't ready to give up. That could have been anyone trying to use stolen credentials. Sophia nodded. That's exactly right, and I know who. She clicked again, revealing an email thread from Mark Reynolds, the company's vice president of finance. Ladies and gentlemen, meet the real architect of this fraud. Gasps erupted in the courtroom. These emails were retrieved from internal servers. They show that Mark Reynolds had access to employees' login credentials. He also had remote access to override security logs. And guess what? He was one of only 3 employees who had clearance to process high-value transactions at night. Sophia took a breath, her voice steady, unshaken. This was never about me. It was about covering his tracks. He needed a scapegoat. Judge Holloway leaned forward, his tone now serious. Miss Carter, do you have proof that Reynolds accessed your credentials? Sophia's lips curled into a confident smirk. Yes, Your Honor. I have 2. She raised one finger. First, we have an IT service request submitted under my name, requesting a password reset the morning after the fraud. But I never made that request. Then, she raised a second finger. Second, we have Reynolds' access logs. IT security flagged his account for multiple suspicious logins, including one at 11:46 p.m., 1 minute before the fraudulent transactions occurred. Lancaster's face drained of color. Sophia turned to the jury one last time. So now, the question isn't whether I committed fraud. The question is why the prosecution never checked this evidence before putting me on trial. The courtroom was silent. Judge Holloway leaned back in his chair, staring at Lancaster. Mr. Lancaster, do you have anything to say? The once confident prosecutor had no response. A heavy silence filled the courtroom. Judge Holloway's gaze locked onto Lancaster, waiting for an answer. But the once confident prosecutor was visibly shaken. His case, his so-called airtight prosecution, was falling apart right in front of him. Sophia turned toward him, her voice calm but razor-sharp. Mr. Lancaster, you've built this entire case around assumptions. You assumed I was guilty because my credentials were used. You assumed my fingerprints on financial reports meant I was involved. But you never once asked the most important question. Who had the most to gain? She gestured toward the screen still displaying Mark Reynolds' access logs. The prosecution failed to investigate the real suspect. But now that the truth is out, let's see how confident you are in your own case. She turned to Judge Holloway. Your Honor, I formally move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against me based on prosecutorial misconduct and failure to properly investigate alternate suspects. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. The jury exchanged glances. Even the bailiff and stenographer seemed intrigued. Judge Holloway exhaled sharply, tapping his fingers on the bench. Mr. Lancaster, do you have any objection to this motion? For the first time since the trial began, David Lancaster was speechless. He clenched his jaw, flipping through his notes, desperately searching for something, anything, to regain control. Sophia didn't give him the chance. She took a step forward, her tone measured but forceful. Your Honor, let's be honest. If this case goes to the jury right now, there's only one logical conclusion they can reach: reasonable doubt. The prosecution has presented a flawed case built on weak evidence, and they failed to disclose exculpatory material that proves my innocence." She let that hang in the air. "And if we're going to talk about reasonable doubt, then let's address the biggest doubt in the room. If I didn't commit this crime, then why am I standing trial instead of Mark Reynolds?" The murmurs grew louder. Some jury members nodded. Judge Holloway sighed, rubbing his temple. His expression wasn't just frustration anymore. There was something else in his eyes now. Recognition. Sophia had been underestimated, and now she was in complete control of the courtroom. Finally, Judge Holloway spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "Mr. Lancaster, last chance. Do you have anything further to present?" Lancaster's face was red with frustration, but he knew the truth. The case was over. With a reluctant breath, he shook his head. "No, Your Honor." Judge Holloway leaned forward, gripping his gavel. His next words would change everything. Judge Holloway exhaled slowly, tapping his gavel against the bench. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air. "Very well," he said, his voice carrying a newfound gravity. He turned his gaze toward Sophia, studying her for a long moment. Then, in a firm tone, he spoke the words that would change everything. "Case dismissed." For a second, the courtroom was completely silent, and then chaos erupted. Reporters scrambled for their notepads, whispering furiously to one another. Spectators gasped. Even the jury, who had been preparing to deliberate, sat in stunned disbelief. Sophia stood motionless at the defense table, letting the moment settle. She had done it. At the prosecutor's table, David Lancaster looked furious. His lips were pressed into a thin line, his fists clenched at his sides. This wasn't just a loss. It was a humiliation. Sophia finally exhaled. She turned, grabbing her case files with steady hands. It was over. As she stepped away from the table, Judge Holloway's voice called out once more. "Miss Carter." She paused but didn't turn right away. For the first time that day, there was no condescension in his tone, no skepticism. Instead, there was something else. Respect. "You should consider law school," he said, his voice quieter this time. Sophia allowed herself a small, knowing smirk. "I already have, Your Honor." The murmur in the gallery grew louder, the weight of the statement sinking in. Sophia had just gone toe-to-toe with an experienced prosecutor, and won. She had outmaneuvered a courtroom that never expected her to fight back. And now, she wasn't going to stop. As she stepped out of the courtroom, reporters swarmed toward her, their microphones flashing. "Miss Carter, how does it feel to have the case dismissed? Did you know all along you'd win? What's next for you?" Sophia ignored them all. She wasn't interested in their spectacle. But at the bottom of the courthouse steps stood her mother, Janet Carter, the woman who had taught her everything she knew about forensic accounting, about finance, about the law. Janet stood with her arms crossed, an unreadable expression on her face. For a long moment, she simply stared at her daughter. Finally, she let out a slow breath. "You scared me half to death, Sophia." Sophia chuckled, running a hand through her hair. "Had to take the risk, Mom." Her mother shook her head, but her lips curled into a small, proud smile. And then, without another word, she pulled Sophia into a tight hug. The cameras kept flashing. The questions kept coming. But Sophia didn't care about any of it, because she wasn't just a defendant anymore. She was something much bigger. Sophia Carter's case was over, but the larger issue remained. How many other people had been convicted not because of solid evidence, but because of careless prosecution? How many people had pleaded guilty to crimes they didn't commit, simply because they didn't have the resources to fight back. Sophia had something that many others didn't: knowledge of the system. She had been raised by a forensic accountant, someone who had taught her how financial crimes worked, how investigations could be flawed, and how data could be manipulated. That knowledge saved her. But what about those who didn't have that advantage? That question burned in her mind as she scrolled through the headlines the next morning. Young woman outsmarts prosecutor in high-stakes fraud case. Sophia Carter, the self-taught legal genius who beat the system. Justice served, or was it almost denied? The world was talking, but talk wasn't enough. Change had to happen. Sophia sat at her laptop, staring at a blank document. Then she began to type. How to defend yourself against a wrongful conviction. A guide, a resource, a weapon for those who didn't have one. She didn't just want to become a lawyer. She wanted to teach others how to fight back. Because next time, it might not be her. It might be someone else. Someone who didn't know their rights. Someone who didn't realize the system wasn't always fair. Someone who didn't have the confidence to stand up for themselves. But if she could change that, even for one person, then everything she had been through would be worth it. This isn't just a story. It's a reality for thousands of people every year. If this case made you think, even for a second, share it. The justice system is built on laws, but it's run by people, and people can change. Stay informed. Learn your rights. Speak up. Subscribe for more stories that matter. And let's keep the conversation going. Because next time, it might not be Sophia. It might be someone you know. Sophia Carter's case was over, but the larger issue remained. How many other people had been convicted not because of solid evidence, but because of careless prosecution? How many people had pleaded guilty to crimes they didn't commit, simply because they didn't have the resources to fight back? Sophia had something that many others didn't: knowledge of the system. She had been raised by a forensic accountant, someone who had taught her how financial crimes worked, how investigations could be flawed, and how data could be manipulated. That knowledge saved her. But what about those who didn't have that advantage? That question burned in her mind as she scrolled through the headlines the next morning. Young woman outsmarts prosecutor in high-stakes fraud case. Sophia Carter, the self-taught legal genius who beat the system. Justice served, or was it almost denied? The world was talking, but talk wasn't enough. Change had to happen. Sophia sat at her laptop, staring at a blank document. Then she began to type. How to defend yourself against a wrongful conviction. A guide, a resource, a weapon for those who didn't have one. She didn't just want to become a lawyer. She wanted to teach others how to fight back. Because next time, it might not be her. It might be someone else. Someone who didn't know their rights. Someone who didn't realize the system wasn't always fair. Someone who didn't have the confidence to stand up for themselves. But if she could change that, even for one person, then everything she had been through would be worth it. This isn't just a story. It's a reality for thousands of people every year. If this case made you think, even for a second, share it. The justice system is built on laws, but it's run by people, and people can change. Stay informed. Learn your rights. Speak up. Subscribe for more stories that matter. And let's keep the conversation going. Because next time, it might not be Sophia. It might be someone you know.